In this lecture, we're moving from antiquity to the modern period, and we'll be talking about apocalyptic currents today, particularly this time around in literature. Your reading for this lecture was by Dr. Shayna Sheinfeld. It was called Scenes from the End of the World in American Popular Culture. And there's a picture of Shayna Sheinfeld. The article by Shayna Sheinfeld gives a great overview of the two apocalypses that are in the Bible, the book of Revelation and the chapters 7 to 12 of the book of Daniel, and also talks about the Genesis flood story, which is not an apocalypse, but is connected to the theme of unmaking or uncreation, which we've talked about before as a part of apocalyptic thinking. And as Dr. Sheinfeld points out, it's a major part of modern apocalyptic fiction. Creation gets disassembled. Cities are built, but then become destroyed wastelands. So the flood is related to that because the flood is a very early Jewish example of the unmaking trope. God creates the world, God regrets it, and God threatens to destroy it and covers it up in a flood. Sheinfeld also discusses John J. Collins' classic definition of the apocalypse genre. She recaps Collins' definition of the genre, first quoting it and then putting it into her own words. She says, according to John J. Collins, apocalypse can be defined as a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality, which is both temporal or part of time, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. In other words, it talks about the end of time and who will be saved from destruction at the end of time, and spatial. In other words, it takes up actual space insofar as it involves another supernatural world, so a different place. Sheinfeld continues to say Collins' definition, developed in conjunction with the Society of Biblical Literature Genres Project, was published originally in 1979 and has served as the foundation upon which subsequent studies in the field of ancient apocalypses have built. And that's so true, because you may have noticed if you look at the bibliography of every single chapter of your textbook, almost every author quotes Collins. And Shayna Sheinfeld's article for this week is not from your textbook, but it too discusses Collins. Almost every discussion of ancient Jewish and Christian apocalypses at least has a footnote to Collins. She continues, Collins' definition provided a point of departure for the study of apocalyptic literature in the ancient world. In other words, it was a pivot point when he set down, like, okay, what are these texts? What do they all have in common? Is it a literary genre? Is it like a subcategory of literature on its own? Yes, it is. She says that before Collins' definition, the noun apocalypse and the adjective apocalyptic had been used within scholarship without any consistency from scholar to scholar. Collins's definition breaks down the genre of apocalypse into identifiable pieces. And then here's a really great way that she reiterates his definition but puts it into her own words and makes it a lot simpler. So first, to call a text an apocalypse, it must be 1, a narrative that includes 2, a revelation, 2, 3, a human recipient, through, for, an otherworldly being. This revelation must include some reflection on 5, salvation at the end times, and on 6, God, angels, demons, heaven, hell, or other parts of the supernatural world. Sheinfeld points out that Collins's definition, quote, is strictly a definition of genre. That means type, a literary type. You know, like science fiction is a genre. Epic is a genre. Romantic comedy is a genre of movie. So Collins defines apocalypse as a certain genre of ancient literature and does not attempt to identify or explain the function or social settings of the ancient apocalypses. But what if we want, as Sheinfeld does in her article, to talk about apocalyptic literature, film, and TV now? It doesn't fit Collins's genre. You know, if a movie is coming out this year and it's sort of about some sort of end of the world or post end of the world, is it really, can we expect that it's going to have a revelation from God through an angel using codes and symbols to a human recipient who is a seer, and all the other bits of Collins's genre? No, actually. Modern contemporary apocalyptic literature doesn't fit the ancient genre, but as Sheinfeld points out, it definitely shares some of the worldview and draws from the ancient tropes to make new stuff. So Sheinfeld talks about there being a continuity from the Bible right up to post-apocalyptic literature today, but it's a messy continuity. The genre doesn't stay stable, and we've already talked about how the genre, even in late antiquity, kind of fell out of popularity, but the ideas and the social situations that make people think apocalyptically, they lived on, but they morphed into things like mysticism. They became more individual rather than collective, and some of the elements of the genre dropped away, but at the same time, they still have a lot of the same kinds of thinking that the ancient people who wrote apocalypses had. Collins's definition of apocalypse as a literary genre rarely fits contemporary iterations of apocalyptic literature. Is there really, in a television series in the 2000s, going to be all of these elements, a seer, an interpreting angel, an otherworldly journey like a chariot journey to different layers of heaven and hell, or eschatological salvation, like are people going to be fleeing the wrath of God? Or is there really going to be like a division of history into weeks and this strong dualism between good and evil? Is there going to be demons, angels, ancient divine Jewish messengers? Probably not. New definitions that are broader, like the one that Sheinfeld comes up with and Lorenza DiTomasso, also mentioned in the article, come up with, they help us analyze apocalyptic themes and structures across time, not just for Jewish and Christian antiquity. Here are 2 quotes about apocalypticism today. Sheinfeld, in her article called Teaching Cormac McCarthy's The Road, says, movies, books, and other forms of popular culture identified with the apocalypse genre often portray not the end of our world exactly, but the beginning of a new societal order after the destruction of the current one. In other words, popular culture today is often post-apocalyptic rather than apocalyptic. So the ancient apocalypses sort of predicted the end of the world and said, we're living in the time of the end of the world, and here's how it's going to end and what will happen. But they don't describe, they might say that all things will be made new and some people will be saved, and some people will be punished at the end. But what Sheinfeld is saying is that actually the end has often already happened in contemporary apocalyptic fiction. Zombie apocalypses, the horrible end has happened and the world has become infested with zombies, and now it's about living after the apocalypse. Or lots of literature, and we'll look at some examples today, have something bad has already happened, and now how are the people going to build a new world or rebuild the world, or how are the people going to survive after it's all broken down? Now, Lorenzo DiTomasso, who's pictured on this slide, he's a little bit younger there. His hair's probably a bit grayer now. He works at the religion department at Concordia University in Montreal. And he works with the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, ancient apocalypses, but also with modern apocalypticism. He says the apocalyptic worldview, so not the genre of literature, but the worldview of the people making apocalyptic stuff, is defined by its axiomatic propositions about the nature of space, time, and human existence. So he's saying that people who share an apocalyptic worldview, whether ancient or modern, they have certain truth claims about space, time, and human existence. These axioms or truth claims, considered together, anchor the claims of apocalyptic speculation and accord meaning to apocalyptic phenomena. Nothing is apocalyptic independent of the worldview. So he's saying that an apocalyptic worldview, whether it's someone in the United States in 2022 or someone in a Hellenistic Jewish community in 300 BCE, they share certain ways of reading the world. They have assumptions about linear time, about the role of humans, about God, and they read the world through those assumptions. And what Sheinfeld says in her article is that it's more useful to look at DiTomasso's definition rather than Collins when we're talking about modern apocalyptic literature. She says Lorenzo DiTomasso soundly rejects the focus on the genre of apocalypse for the study of ancient apocalypses, and instead pushes for a focus on the worldview of apocalypticism as a starting point, what Collins might have called the apocalyptic imagination. DiTomasso also rejects the focus on only those apocalypses found in antiquity. He wants to study the phenomenon across time. Instead, DiTomasso's analysis attempts to develop an approach that considers that apocalypticism is a worldview that has had followers from at least as early as the earliest extant or existing apocalyptic texts, so maybe the 3rd century BCE, but it can also be found not only in ancient literature, but also throughout history and in different cultures, including in contemporary pop culture. DiTomasso defines apocalypticism as a worldview of fundamental cognitive orientation that makes claims about time, space, and human existence. And he says that this category can cover all different kinds of media because apocalypticism is the message, not the medium. So it doesn't have to fit all of Collins's generic or genre criteria in order to be apocalyptic. That is one ancient literary genre, but the worldview can be seen in all different genres. Like we saw that worldview coming through in Jesus' words in the Gospels. We saw that worldview coming through in different kinds of mystical texts from late antiquity. And we see now, for the rest of the class, we're going to be talking about contemporary apocalyptic thinking, and we're going to see that worldview coming through in literature and movies now. So just to recap, what did we learn already about the ancient apocalyptic worldview? Ancient Jewish and Christian apocalypses and apocalyptic quotes and texts and and situations in ancient Jewish and Christian history all seem to agree on a few ways of seeing the world. One is they see things as dualistic. The entire universe can be strictly divided into black and white, good and evil, angels or demons, God or the devil, life or death, light or shadow. They all see time as teleological. A telos is Greek for an end. Teleological is linear, moving towards an end, and not infinite. It will end. Time will end. They also see time as divided into good and evil. You know, when the apocalypse of weeks, it divides all of history into a good week, a bad week, a good week, a bad week, different ages. There can be an evil age that you can be in, or a good age that you can be in. And apocalypses in antiquity usually said, we're in a final evil age, but soon there's going to be a final good age. They also all assume that God is in control of history, whether or not it seems like it. Maybe things are going terribly, but apocalypticism for ancient Jews and Christians gave this comfort that no matter how terrible it looks, you might be undergoing a persecution, a genocide. You might have no control over events. It might be people are dying. It's totally terrible. But the belief is that this is temporary because in the long arc of history, God remains in control. We just can't see it all the time. And the righteous will be vindicated and the oppressors will fall. And that will happen ultimately at a cataclysmic break between the two ages, the day of the Lord. The final evil age will be cataclysmically ended in some kind of battle or judgment, and will inaugurate the day of the Lord and a permanent good age, but the judgment that's involved in it will not be pretty. And what they all seemed to think was that that day was coming very, very soon. Here's DiTomasso's definition of that worldview, which he tries to map onto ancient and modern apocalypticism alike. You know how John J. Collins had what he called the apocalyptic imagination, but he really focused it on the people who wrote ancient Jewish and Christian apocalypses. Well, DiTomasso is going to redefine that apocalyptic imagination so that it'll be able to fit ancient and contemporary people. He says apocalypticism presumes the existence of a transcendent reality. So that's different from saying a transcendent God, the Jewish God, or later the Christian God. There is a transcendent reality. Because, in modern apocalyptic stuff, there may not even be anything religious. It may not be a God. It might be a truth that only a few people in the book figure out, maybe because they are particularly gifted, observant, they learned something secret. Even the Matrix even has this. There's the reality that you see, and then there's the actual reality, the transcendent reality that's only visible to a chosen few. So yes, a transcendent reality which defines the cosmos and everything in it, but remains almost entirely concealed from observation and beyond the grasp of human intellection. So for ancient stuff, what they needed to learn about that almost entirely concealed reality was a mediator, like an angel, some sort of divine being that would just tell or take on a tour and show the seer the actual reality. Whereas in contemporary apocalypses, if they're not particularly Jewish or Christian, that reality may not be mediated by an angel, but it's still something that only a few people, not particularly seers, but people who can, for some reason, see something different, the few people somehow, whether they, eat the right pill or uncover a plot or conspiracy, or maybe they communicate with an alien, for whatever they uncover, dig up some ancient computer file or book. Yes, they learn something that's concealed from normal human intellect. Apocalypticism contends that the present reality is constitutionally structured by two antagonistic and irreducible forces, which are typically identified with good and evil. Now, Sheinfeld will argue with that, and your novel, Good Omens, may argue with that too. It's not so dualistic all the time in now modern apocalypses, but according to DiTomasso, there still is that dualism between good and evil. Oh, but it might just be environmentalists versus big business or something secular. The apocalyptic worldview further assumes that the revelation of these mysteries orients existence and gives life meaning and purpose. So the people in modern apocalypses who uncover the conspiracy or see the right way to handle things, that they are driven by meaning and purpose. It orients their whole existence. They're given a mission to live the right way and to communicate the ultimate truth, even if it's like a way of stopping climate change or a way of defeating the zombies. Together, these propositions describe an apocalyptic minimum. So these definitions by DiTomasso are the minimum, like they are the core across time in all apocalyptic thinking, according to him. And he says these things distinguish apocalypticism from prophecy, mysticism, divination, and other phenomena, and by which cultural expressions and social movements throughout history may be identified as apocalyptic, including those in the realm of popular culture. So that's from his article called Apocalypticism and Popular Culture in the Oxford Handbook of Apocalyptic Literature. So DiTomasso here is really trying to reframe apocalypticism so it doesn't focus on one ancient Jewish and Christian literary genre, but it focuses on people across time, from Jewish antiquity to Hollywood today, who think apocalyptically, and tries to reduce that to like, can I come to a definition that encompasses them all? But according to Shayna Sheinfeld, even DiTomasso doesn't quite broaden his definition far enough to include what she calls an explosion of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction today. For one thing, she says, it's very often not as dualistic as DiTomasso says. Like, he still thinks it's always good versus evil. She thinks it's often much more complicated and messy and ambiguous now. It's more secular. There are more environmental apocalypses that are really just about taking better care of the planet. But she does agree with DiTomasso that there is a link. Contemporary post-apocalyptic and dystopic lit still pull from the ancient texts, whether it's Genesis or Revelation or some of the non-canonical ones like First Enoch that you looked at. She talks specifically in her article about good omens. Note in her article there's a spoiler for Good Omens, so be aware of that if you haven't read it yet, if you're not finished the novel. She talks about how Good Omens and supernatural both draw directly from the book of Revelation. So even though they're not apocalypses, they're definitely in a lineage that draws from ancient apocalypses. She also looks at two examples of pop culture apocalypticism that use the flood narrative from Genesis 6-9. She looks at Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, and she looks at the secular environmental apocalyptic movie 2012. There are apocalyptic carryovers, as Sheinfeld argues, in contemporary literature. Ancient apocalypses brought hope because they were written in a context of suffering, persecution, genocide, foreign occupation, poverty, whatever it was. And they offered a future hope. Things are bad now, but they will get better. Contemporary apocalypses can definitely do that too. People can be in a dystopic landscape or a post-apocalyptic landscape, and they can overcome and start to build a new world. Ancient apocalypses were a revelation from specifically usually an angel or some divine being. There may not be that divine revelation in contemporary apocalyptic literature, but there still is something being revealed to the protagonists or to the audience. They do try and reveal or uncover problems in contemporary society. Maybe it's authoritarianism. Maybe it's gender and racial oppression. Think of the chrysalids, how they showed it was post-apocalyptic, some kind of nuclear disaster happened, and there were all these mutant people who had genetic mutations, probably due to radiation. Those people were pushed to the margins, the fringe of society. They were rejected. That's a commentary on not the rejection of mutants, but the rejection of maybe racialized people or differently gendered people or women, etc., etc. Maybe contemporary apocalyptic literature or dystopia or speculative fiction reveals problems in the way we handle our relationship to the environment, climate change. Maybe it's about colonialism, corporate greed, political corruption. Those things are problems in society that are revealed in some way by contemporary apocalyptic literature or dystopic lit or post-apocalyptic lit, even though it's not necessarily through an angel, like literally a divine being. It's still uncovered. The four horsemen or the four riders of the apocalypse mentioned in the book of Revelation feature prominently in like sort of biblically drawn apocalyptic stuff today, including Good Omens in a big way. In your novel, Good Omens, that you'll have to read before the final exam, we see a mix. There are contemporary pop cultural ideas of the end of the world, but there are also definite allusions to ancient texts like Revelation, Genesis, 1 Enoch, and even the Johannine letters that are the main place in the Bible that the Antichrist is mentioned. The book borrows heavily from other Antichrist traditions as well. It's not just strictly the way the Antichrist is described in the letters of 1st and 2nd John, but also all the accruement down through the centuries of additional traditions that get lumped onto this Antichrist, or the way Hollywood pictures the Antichrist. The Good Omens novel uses both ancient and modern Antichrist traditions. But like Sheinfeld points out, the modern things, such as this novel, Good Omens, are not as strictly dualistic. Is this novel, I want you to think about this, even for the final exam. This novel literally has angels and they work for heaven, and demons and they work for hell. You would think it's straight up, obviously, overtly dualistic and simplistically dualistic. But as we get to know the characters of the main angel and the main demon, we see that they are quite similar. They get along very well. They help each other. They both share a love for many things that humans typically enjoy, like food and fine drink, fine wine, dining. tea and coffee, nice cars, books. They both love a lot of the same things. So it's more complicated than strict dualism. All the characters are complex. Are angels automatically on the side of good? Look at Metatron in Good Omens. Is that a good character? Neutral? Not working for the side of good? Just bureaucratic, like thoughtlessly bureaucratic? There's something more going on there than good versus evil. Does Good Omens reveal something? Is it a revelation? I would argue that yes, just like most contemporary apocalyptic pieces of fiction, it's trying very hard to reveal things about the world the way they are now. In my opinion, it's a book that definitely wants to reveal how lucky we are to be human, how precious we are to have the simple things that the angels really end up trying to prevent the apocalypse in order to keep having. The ability to enjoy a meal, the ability to sit down and have a glass of champagne, the ability to have free will, to make choices that alter the way things go. All these things about being human, when you get to look at them through the eyes of these angels and demons, you get to see that, not all the beings have these abilities. So we should really see them as precious, and we should make great use of our humanness. Good Omens definitely has a sub-theme of bureaucracy and being anti-bureaucracy and seeing bureaucracy as at best a waste of time, but at worst a kind of soul-crushing and potentially maybe evil thing. I'm not sure. Take a look at the theme of bureaucracy throughout the book as you read it, and compare it with the Testament of Abraham. The heaven seen in the Testament of Abraham, where like certain rules are in place, and the way Abraham jumps in and tries to judge human souls ends up upsetting the bureaucracy of heaven, and God has to be like, no, wait, we're going to need some more rules in place because he's going way too hard on people. We need to introduce the concept of mercy. So yes, ancient and modern ways of commenting on mercy. The Antichrist is something that features extremely prominently in Good Omens. Here's a quote taken from the book. One of the satanic nuns, Sister Mary, gets to meet the baby that is actually the Antichrist that has just been delivered from hell to kick off the end of the world. She says, "Is that him? Only I'd expected funny eyes, red or green, or teensy weensy little hoofykins, or a whittled tail." She turned him around as she spoke. No horns either. The devil's child looked ominously normal. "Yes, that's him," said Crowley. "Fancy me holding the Antichrist," said Sister Mary, "and bathing the Antichrist, and counting his little toesy woesies." She was now addressing the child directly, lost in some world of her own. Crowley waved a hand in front of her wimple. "Hello? Hello? Sister Mary? Sorry, sir, he is a little sweetheart, though. Does he look like his daddy? I bet he does. Does he look like his daddy Waddykins?" So the novel introduces the Antichrist, not in a way that's necessarily biblical, but drawing on traditions that have grown up over centuries, as someone who's going to be born, a single person who's going to be born and grow up to inaugurate the end of the world, and to fight on the side of hell, Satan, the devil, evil. And the joke, of course, is that this satanic nun is really delighted to meet the baby Antichrist and is just treating him like anyone would treat a cute baby. You might be surprised to learn that the Antichrist is from the Bible, but it's actually not from the book of Revelation. The main place in the Bible that the Antichrist is mentioned is in these little short letters called the Johannine epistles, particularly in 1 John and 2 John. And here is the way the Antichrist is introduced in the New Testament. 1 John 2:18, children, it is the last hour. As you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. From this we know that it is the last hour. So right away, we see that in 1 John, the Antichrist is plural. There are many of them, and they're going to come to show that it's the last hour. And according to the writer of that book, it has happened. So it's being written in the last hour. So the author of this book thinks the end of the world is imminent. It's about to happen, which is quite common in the first century into the second century of some early Jesus followers and early Christians. They definitely thought it was the end of time right then and there. Notice it's not really a single individual. It's more of a concept and that many people will start to follow and buy into. So the biblical Antichrist is quite different from the one from pop culture and the one in Good Omens. 1 John 2:22, a couple verses later in that letter, who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ, or that Jesus is the Savior or Messiah, deliverer? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. So according to this author of the letter, 1 John, the definition of an Antichrist is anyone at all, who basically doesn't believe in the divinity of Jesus or that Jesus is the Messiah. So all of the people around this author who say no, like Jesus was a good rabbi, but he got killed and he's not the Messiah, those are all antichrists. So that's quite different from what we see in Good Omens. Later in the letter, 1 John 4:3, he writes, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world. So once again, he reiterates, the spirit of the Antichrist is the spirit of not believing certain early Christian claims that Jesus is sent from God. Anyone who doesn't buy into that is labeled Antichrist by the author of 1 John, who's the main person who mentions this word in the New Testament. And once again, he reiterates that this end time has already started. The fact that people don't believe that Jesus has come from God signals that the world's going to be destroyed soon and start fresh. And then the second Johannine letter, 2 John chapter 7, says, many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So here he adds another doctrinal thing that he's concerned about. He's not just concerned that everyone should believe that Jesus is from God, and everyone should believe that Jesus is the Messiah or Savior, but every person who doesn't believe that Jesus came in the flesh is an Antichrist. Now that is a second century debate. That is a debate about whether Jesus was human at all. Some people in the second century started to say Jesus is actually divine, and they took it further and said, actually, he's not even human at all. He was like a spirit. he didn't have a body. Because if he were divine, how could he die be crucified in a very mundane and torturous form of a brutal execution? That couldn't happen to God. Therefore, his body was just a mirage and he was completely a spirit. This controversy is what the author of 1st and 2nd John is getting at, and calling people who are on, in his opinion, the wrong side of that controversy about the exact nature of Jesus. They are the Antichrist, and that is the biblical definition of Antichrist. Now, there is a different concept in the New Testament, the lawless one, or the man of lawlessness. This we find mainly in a book called 2nd Thessalonians. There are 2 quotes here on this slide from 2nd Thessalonians that encourage people about the second coming of Jesus, which they're expecting. They're expecting that as an apocalypse any day. So they're waiting around for Jesus to come back, and this is some encouragement for them as they wait. They say, "We beg you, brothers and sisters, don't be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or by word or by letter as though from us." So this letter purports to be by Paul, and it's saying, don't listen to any other letters that say that they're written by me. The irony is, scholars don't think this letter was written by Paul. So there's a lot of forgeries flying around, and they're debating intensely, hammering out what is Christianity. It's just in the process of being born. So at this author, whoever it is, says, don't be swayed by all these things you might hear or see around you, saying that the day of the Lord is already here. Don't let anyone deceive you in that way, because that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. Now, this book is at odds with 1st and 2nd John. 1st and 2nd John are saying the time has come. We see Antichrist, and so we know that it is the last hour. 2nd Thessalonians seems like perhaps it was written earlier, because it's predicting that a lawless one is going to come, but hasn't come yet. And therefore it says we're not in the last day isn't here yet. This other thing with a lawless one has to happen first. Yes. And what's going to happen to this lawless one? Well, 2 Thessalonians 2, 7-10 says, the mystery of lawlessness, it's sort of like being an outlaw or being unrighteous, is already at work, but only until the one who now restrains it is removed. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will destroy with the breath of his mouth. That's interesting because in Revelation it says Jesus will come back and have a sword coming out of his mouth. So destruction is predicted to be in Jesus' mouth when he comes back, annihilating the lawless one by coming. The coming of the lawless one is apparent in the working of Satan. So here we're getting a bunch of different characters involved in the end of time. Satan, many antichrists, a certain lawless one that claims to be God. All of this is swirling around in the 1st and 2nd century, when they're still really thinking about the end of the world. Even in the Gospels, both Matthew and Mark mention false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce great signs and omens to lead you astray. So this is definitely a concern, but we can see from these texts and how they're all a little bit different from each other that none of them predict an Antichrist at the end of the world the way people think the book of Revelation does. The concept of Antichrist is actually quite different than we see it in pop culture and in Good Omens. But something from the book of Revelation is very prominent in Good Omens, and that is the concept found in Revelation of the apocalyptic horse persons, or the harbingers of the apocalypse, or the commonly known four horsemen of the apocalypse. We read Revelation together, this passage, and we saw that the identity of the four horses is a bit ambiguous, and not all interpreters agree, but in Good Omens, the four are identified as death, war, famine, and pollution. And then pollution is a new one because pestilence retired. So death, war, famine, and pollution are the harbingers of the end of time that appear in Good Omens. Revelation 6, 1-8 is the main place in Scripture where we get the idea of the four horse riders. We've read this together before. The Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out with a voice of thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there was a white horse. So this is the first horse person of the apocalypse in Revelation. Its rider had a bow, like a bow and arrow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. So there's the first horse. It's white, and its rider conquers. In Good Omens, I suppose that one is pollution. And the second seal gets opened. I heard the second living creature call out, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. So the second horse is red in color, and the rider takes peace away. So this is interpreted in Good Omens as war. His name is War, or her name actually, in the case of this novel, with her bright red hair. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine." So here's a business person dealing in food. And in Good Omens, this black horse is described as famine. And particularly in the novel, famine is linked to diet culture, which is an interesting take. Self-imposed famine and anorexia and stuff like that are addressed, caused by this writer in the novel. And lastly, when he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. So, sword, famine, and pestilence are the previous 3 horses. Basically, the sword is the red horse, famine is the black horse, pestilence is the white horse, that gets replaced by pollution in Good Omens, and by the wild animals of the earth. So together, the last pale green horse, Death, along with Hades, I don't know if that means the god of the underworld, like an individual from Greek and Roman sort of myth, or if it means like all of the underworld, like an army. But along with Hades, sword, famine, pestilence, and wild animals, Death is given permission to kill 1/4 of the world. Compare to, remember in some of the books of prophecy, much earlier, the Hebrew prophets, these 4 horses or this like impending judgment are foreshadowed, or maybe the idea is drawn from these prophets. Ezekiel 14 says, "For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 deadly acts of judgment, sword, famine, wild animals, and pestilence, to cut off humans and animals from it." So there we definitely see these tropes beginning, predictions of some kind of judgment that involve sword, famine, wild animals, and pestilence in this case. The same goes for the book of Zechariah, another Hebrew prophet, in chapter 6. He's having a vision. He looks up. He sees 4 chariots. So 4 chariots, 4 horse riders, coming out from between 2 mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second chariot black horses, the third chariot white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled gray horses. So there we have 4 different chariots drawn by horses with different colors. So Revelation is aware of these books, or at least aware of these traditions in the air. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel answered me, "These are the 4 winds of heaven going out after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes toward the north country. The white ones go toward the west country. The dappled ones go toward the south country." When the steeds came out, they were impatient to get off and patrol the earth. And he said, "Go, patrol the earth." So they patrolled the earth. So here you can see how all of the traditions are slightly different, but they're definitely interrelated, and they show that this idea of judgment comes with sort of different colors, different horses, different types of death, whether plague or war or famine. And here is an excerpt from your novel. It says, "It did not escape their notice that all 4 strangers had Hell's Angels on their jackets." So these 4 strangers are actually, as we know as we read the novel, the actual 4 horse persons of the apocalypse. But they meet up with other Hell's Angels, like motorbike gang type people. And so these motorbike people are skeptical of these Hell's Angels. They're like, "We don't even recognize these Hell's Angels. Are they legit?" And they look dead dodgy as far as the angels were concerned. Oh, dead dodgy is British slang for very sketchy. Dead is very and dodgy is sketchy. Too clean for a start. And none of the 4 looked like they'd ever broken anyone's arm just because it was Sunday afternoon and there wasn't anything good on the telly. And one was a woman, too, only not riding around on the back of someone's bike, but actually allowed one of her own, like she had any right to it. So these like Earth Hell's Angels are not impressed by these actual Hell's Angels that have Hell's Angels on their jackets. They look too clean and they're a bit skeptical. "You're Hell's Angels then?" asked Big Ted, sarcastically. "If there's one thing real Hell's Angels can't abide, it's weekend bikers." The 4 strangers nodded. "What chapter are you from then?" The tall stranger looked at Big Ted. Then he stood up. It was a complicated motion. If the shores of the seas of night had deck chairs, they'd open up something like that. He seemed to be unfolding himself forever. He wore a dark helmet, completely hiding his features, and it was made of that weird plastic, Big Ted noted. Like you looked at it and all you could see was your own face. "Revelations," he said, "chapter 6. So the Hells Angels of Earth are like, "Which chapter are you from?" And they mean like, which region of the Hells Angels motorbike club. And the actual horseman of the apocalypse is confused by this, and he thinks they mean which chapter of the book of Revelation. So he says chapter 6. Verses 2 to 8 added the boy in white helpfully. The boy in white is pollution. Big Ted glared at the four of them. His lower jaw began to protrude, and a little blue vein in his temple started to throb. "What's that mean, then?" he demanded. There was a tug at his sleeve. It was Pigbog. He had gone a peculiar shade of gray under the dirt. So Pigbog is a character who starts to get the point of that these guys are really important. "It means we're in trouble," said Pigbog. And then the tall stranger reached up a pale motorbike gauntlet and raised the visor of his helmet, and Big Ted found himself wishing, for the first time in his existence, that he'd lived a better life. "Jesus Christ," he moaned. "I think he may be along in a minute," said Pigbog urgently. "He's probably looking for somewhere to park his bike. Let's go and join a youth club or something." But Big Ted's invincible ignorance was his shield and armor. He didn't move. "Core," he said. "Hell's Angels." Core is a British slang that is a euphemism for God. It's like saying God. Core. Or sort of like golly or gosh. War flipped him a lazy salute. "That's us, Big Ted," she said. "The real McCoy." Famine nodded. "The old firm," he said. See that? There's another indication of bureaucracy. Like heaven and hell are actually just bureaucratic entities. It's called the firm, like the business, the office. Pollution removed his helmet and shook out his long white hair. He had taken over when Pestilence, muttering about penicillin, had retired in 1936. If only the old boy had known what opportunities the future had held. So apparently because of the invention of penicillin, or antibiotics, plague, pestilence had retired because it was no fun anymore, and pollution had taken over as one of the four horsemen. "Others promise," he said. "We deliver." Big Ted looked at the fourth horseman. "I seen you before," he said. "You was on the cover of the Blue Oyster Cult album, and I got a ring with your head on it." "I get everywhere." "Core." Big Ted's big face screwed up with the effort of thought. "What kind of bike you riding?" he said. So that is the one of the descriptions of the four horsemen in your novel, Good Omens. I want to point out that they make a huge common mistake, which is putting an S on the end of the book of Revelation. It's extremely common, but there's just no S there. The book is called The Apocalypse, The Revelation. So don't put an S on it. I also want to point out that this book was written before the pandemic, but it kind of mocks Pestilence for quitting too soon, and it talks about how there's still lots more opportunity for Pestilence. So is that prescient? Is that prophecy in Good Omens? Now I'd like to talk about dualism, like a very obvious division between good and evil, a final battle, Jesus and Satan, angels and demons, Jesus wins, hell loses, heaven wins. This is the discourse of the book of Revelation, and this is the discourse of Good Omens, but it's a little bit blurry in Good Omens. This ancient definition of apocalypses that points to a strict dualism gets murky when it comes to a lot of modern apocalypses, as Shayna Sheinfeld points out, but specifically it gets murky in Good Omens. Here's a quote. "You can't second guess ineffability, I always say. There's right and there's wrong. If you do wrong when you're told to do right, you deserve to be punished," said the angel. I'm not sure it's actually possible for you to do evil, said Crawley sarcastically. Aziraphale didn't notice the tone. Oh, I do hope so, he said. I really do hope so. It's been worrying me all afternoon. They watched the rain for a while. Funny thing is, said Crowley, I keep wondering whether the apple thing wasn't the right thing to do as well. A demon can get into real trouble doing the right thing. He nudged the angel. Funny if we both got it wrong, eh? Funny if I did the good thing and you did the bad one, eh? Not really, said Aziraphale. Crowley looked at the rain. No, he said, sobering up. I suppose not. So I'm going to leave it to you as you read the book to decide how this protagonist angel and this protagonist demon fit in with a spectrum from good to evil as opposed to a dualism of just a switch, black and white, good and evil. Even the Antichrist in the novel is not necessarily clear-cut. Aziraphale was looking thoughtful again. You're saying the child isn't evil of itself? He said slowly. Potentially evil. Potentially good, too, I suppose. Just this huge, powerful potentiality waiting to be shaped, said Crowley. He shrugged. Anyway, why are we talking about this good and evil? They're just names for sides. We know that. Adam, which is the name of the Antichrist in the novel, stood smiling at the two of them, a small figure perfectly poised exactly between heaven and hell. Well, I mean, spoiler alert, Adam and Crowley and Aziraphale, the Antichrist, the angel, and the demon all work together in this novel to prevent the end of the world and prevent the apocalypse. So this is not dualism. This is an absolute mess. It's turning things on their heads in terms of apocalyptic expectations. The fact that the Antichrist is named Adam is very nice because it brings in the notion of uncreation, unmaking that Sheinfeld mentions and that your textbook mentions earlier, how the end of the world is about things falling apart, but then also about things starting fresh. So this kid, Adam, who's potentially evil, but also potentially good, but definitely very powerful, because he is the son of Satan, literally, the seed, the offspring. His dad is the devil. But at the same time, nature versus nurture, his parents were just very lovely British people, and he was loved and he had a good upbringing. So the Antichrist didn't turn out evil because of different privileges and opportunities that he had, and forces that shaped him, he ended up turning out good. If one of the criteria of an ancient apocalypse is that it is a revelation, is Good Omens a revelation? Is anything being uncovered? Is anything being communicated to the audience that is insider knowledge? It does provide this description of God's relationship to the universe that is not your typical description of it. It says God moves in extremely mysterious, not to say circuitous ways. God does not play dice with the universe. He plays an ineffable game of his own devising, which might be compared, from the perspective of any of the other players, to being involved in an obscure and complex version of poker in a pitch-dark room with blank cards for infinite stakes, with a dealer who won't tell you the rules and who smiles all the time. So there is the novel's explanation of God's relationship to the universe. And they continuously refer to ineffability as something different from good and evil. There are the sides. the bureaucratic sides. There's heaven and hell and all the people who work there, and a hierarchical chain of different jobs, different positions within the firm of heaven and the firm of hell. But those are not the highest layers of the bureaucracy. Above them is God, and the rules of that higher, ineffable game are actually not necessarily known to the kind of mundane office workers who are angels and demons for the two companies of heaven and hell. And there's a quote there. I won't take time to read it all, but it involves the character of Metatron. And I'd like you to think about, is this character good, evil, neutral? Is it ambiguous? Little of both? What's going on here? And the same goes for the character of the Antichrist, Adam. Especially take note of Aziraphale talking about the great plan, how there's a difference between the great plan and the ineffable plan. He says, yep, that's the great plan, all right. So the typical end of the world, war, heaven wins, hell loses, total annihilation, huge apocalypse. That's the great plan, all right, said Aziraphale. He spoke politely and respectfully, but with the air of one who has just asked an unwelcome question at a political meeting and won't go away until he gets an answer. I was just asking if it's ineffable as well. I just want to be clear on this point. It doesn't matter, snapped the Metatron. It's the same thing, surely. Surely, thought Crowley. They don't actually know. He started to grin like an idiot. So you're not 100% clear on this, said Aziraphale. And so there's this discussion of, well, there's the great plan, but then there could be the ineffable plan, which might not involve a war at the end of the world. There's some doubts have been cast on whether the great plan is actually the plan. More discussion. So for the final part of this lecture, which I realize is long because it actually is 2 days worth of classroom lecture. For the final part, I'd like to draw your attention to some examples of contemporary apocalyptic literature. And these could be apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, dystopic, speculative fiction, even science fiction, maybe fantasy. All these different genres can participate in thinking about unmaking the world and starting fresh, or ending the world, whether in a biblical way with like Good Omens with the Antichrist, angels and demons, or in a secular way with different kinds of end of the world that could be related to environmental crisis or other breakdowns of human society. So the first example I want to point out to you, you don't have to read it or know about the plot for your exam. I'm just sharing some examples. Octavia E. Butler has written a novel called The Parable of the Sower. And the blurb by Gloria Steinem says, if there's one thing scarier than a dystopian novel about the future, it's one written in the past that has already begun to come true. This is what makes Parable of the Sower even more impressive than it was when it was first published. So there's an interesting concept. Do contemporary apocalyptic fictional works reveal truths? In the case of Parable of the Sower, and this has been said about Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale and other works of speculative fiction, that sometimes they are making deliberate, precise social commentaries on things that could actually happen and that they would like to shape so that they don't happen. They're very often a kind of prophecy, just like ancient prophecy, which commented on social ills, or ancient apocalypses, which actually commented on current social ills. Modern apocalyptic and dystopic fiction is very often about trying to make the reader jolt into living life a better way or looking out to prevent bad endings to culture, to society, to the planet, etc. The plot is that it's California in the 2020s. It descends into anarchy and violence, but one woman has the power to transform everything in this alarmingly prescient dystopia that takes in climate change, inequality, and racism. America is a place of chaos where violence rules and only the rich and powerful are safe. Lauren Olamina, a young woman with the extraordinary power to feel the pain of others as her own, records everything she sees of this broken world in her journal. Then, one terrible night, everything alters beyond recognition, and Lauren must make her voice heard for the sake of those she loves. Soon her vision becomes reality, and her dreams of a better way to live gain the power to change humanity forever. So just think about your ancient apocalypses and reflect on similarities and differences there. It's not an angel mediating something from God, but she is still a kind of seer. She has a special sight that is sort of extreme empathy. So just like Sheinfeld says, there are messy continuities. These are obviously not ancient Jewish apocalypses, but they are definitely drawing on ancient tropes and reworking them. Another one I'd like to bring to your attention is The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Dimeline, who is a Métis author. It's a young adult novel. It's dystopian fiction. The blurb says, in a futuristic world ravaged by global warming, people have lost the ability to dream, and the dreamlessness has led to widespread madness. The only people still able to dream are North America's indigenous people, and it is their marrow that holds the cure for the rest of the world. But getting the marrow and dreams means death for the unwilling donors. Driven to flight, a 15-year-old and his companions struggle for survival, attempt to reunite with loved ones, and take refuge from the recruiters who seek them out to bring them to the marrow-stealing factories. The book reflects real experiences of Indigenous families in North America, the residential school system, the 60s scoop, where kids were en masse taken away from their Indigenous parents so that they could be, so that literally the phrase used was, kill the Indian to save the child. In other words, make the child's life better by taking it away from Indigenous language, culture, just getting rid of all of their indigeneity and just making them mini white European kids as a way of quote unquote saving them. But of course the irony is the residential school system, the child welfare system, and in some cases the 60s scoop system ended up killing them and destroying them in other ways. So once again, dystopian fiction, just like ancient apocalypses, can be a powerful means of social commentary, especially when the things depicted in its future are actual situations from our past and present. So right from antiquity to today, these post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic works of literature are commentaries on society, powerful critiques. Another one is Future Home of the Living God. This is by Louise Erdrich, an Anishinaabe author. Louise Erdrich paints a startling portrait of a young woman fighting for her life and her unborn child against oppressive forces that manifest in the wake of a cataclysmic event. So that's a throwback to ancient apocalypses. In this dystopian novel, 26-year-old Cedar Hawk songmaker, adopted daughter of a pair of Minneapolis liberals, is as disturbed and uncertain as the rest of America around her. But for Cedar, This change is profound and deeply personal. She's 4 months pregnant. Though she wants to tell the adoptive parents who raised her from infancy, Cedar first feels compelled to find her birth mother, Mary Potts, an Ojibwe, to understand both her and her baby's origins. As Cedar goes back to her own biological beginnings, society around her begins to disintegrate, fueled by a swelling panic about the end of humanity. So you can see again the overlaps with the ancient apocalypses that we read. But the attempt of the book to comment on social reality now, the book reflects real experiences of controlled reproduction and sterilization by American and Canadian states on, Indigenous women especially. And then, of course, there's Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The blurb says, in a burned out America, a father and his young son walk under a darkened sky, heading slowly for the coast. They have no idea what, if anything, awaits them there. The landscape is destroyed. Nothing moves save the ash on the wind, and cruel, lawless men stalk the roadside, lying in wait. Attempting to survive in this brave new world, the young boy and his protector have nothing but a pistol to defend themselves. They must keep walking. So as Sheinfeld notes, this is not the apocalypse, this is post-apocalyptic. Something has already, we don't know what, but something has already ruined the world. The end has happened, and they're literally in the ashes. So this is what Sheinfeld notes, an important shift toward discussing what comes after the apocalypse, which is more common in modern day apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic and dystopian lit. Another Canadian example, the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. Sheinfeld talks about it in your reading. She says the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood traces a group of characters from just before, during, and after a worldwide apocalyptic event. While the event itself is a bioengineered pandemic caused by humans, the expectation of its arrival and how to survive it, as well as other sub-themes found through the trilogy, exemplify Atwood's use of the biblical flood narrative to explore this human-caused pandemic. One unique aspect of Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy is that it combines a secular and a religious approach to apocalypses in contemporary culture. So Margaret Atwood is very aware of the biblical texts. Her university teacher was Northrop Frye at the University of Toronto, who's famous for writing books such as The Great Code about the Bible and Western civilization. And Frye was a major proponent of the idea that to understand Western literature, maybe not now, because we are a more diverse society, immigration has shifted our cultural repertoire, but at the time of Northrop Frye, he felt it held true that if you don't understand the Bible, you actually miss most literary references. You miss many tropes from movies. You miss allusions. You miss interrelatedness of movies, poetry, fiction. He said that the Bible, whether consciously or unconsciously, is like the main code through which symbols have meaning in Western creative works. So Margaret Atwood studied under Northrop Frye. She is aware of this idea that the Bible provides symbols for anything, very quick ways to express good and evil. So it's not a surprise to me that her trilogy is heavily shot through with biblical allusions and heavily draws from the flood narrative in Genesis. But at the same time, like Sheinfeld points out, contemporary apocalypses are more concerned about things like the climate, food insecurity, racial oppression and tension, gender oppression, etc. Sheinfeld leaves us with a couple of questions. One of them is, how do we make comparisons between biblical apocalyptic, secular apocalyptic, and other cultures, for example, ancient Maya, and religions, for example, Hinduism, that have apocalyptic scenarios? That's a question that a student asked on the very first day of class. A student, it was actually Olivia, she asked, okay, but at the same time as these ancient Jewish apocalypses were being written, indigenous cultures around the world also had stories and narratives. They also had ideas about punishment and about time ending or things going catastrophically if we don't have a certain relationship with the land and with each other. So how can you say that ancient Jews and Christians invented apocalypses, which was an amazing question. And I hadn't thought to present it that way. I hadn't thought to say, I'm looking at Jewish history and seeing how these texts influenced our modern texts. But I forgot to say, all over the world, different cultures, different traditions, different religions at different times have also had parallel ideas about the world ending, ideas about punishment if we don't live properly, ideas about a cataclysm and having to deal with it and having to rebuild. So Scheinfeld's article mostly wants to play around with, what do we do when we're looking at TV shows from now and we're looking at ancient Jewish books like First Enoch, the Book of the Watchers, the Apocalypse of Weeks? How do we compare them ethically and in ways that are meaningful? She pulls in Lorenza DiTomasso, who tries to say, well, the literary genre of the ancient apocalypse doesn't map directly onto modern apocalypses. But what if we look instead at the worldview of the people? Can some of those things form a link for us? And he says yes. And they obviously can, but then Scheinfeld wants to say it's messier than that. It's not a clear lineage, but there's definitely relationships, and definitely artists and authors today pull from the air things that have been in existence since the biblical apocalypses, and sometimes quote in Good Omens, for example, overtly, or in Margaret Atwood, overtly from certain biblical texts. A second question posed by Scheinfeld for your reflection: why is there a recent surge in young adult dystopian and apocalyptic popular culture? Is it, as I posit, that along with superhero movies, this growing genre derives from a population that feels they lack control of their circumstances, and that a large segment of the population fears what will happen in the future? Is the increase in this type of genre meant to encourage its audience to take action themselves? If that is the case, are all forms of this genre acts of subversion? So she's referring to Gen Z, which statistically is the first generation that has felt this, what's the opposite of optimistic? This pessimistic about the future. Gen Z is the first generation that frequently reports not believing that older generations are going to do anything, and reports that they feel it is completely up to them. Everyone else before them has let them down in terms of culture, environment, education. Everything has been ruled by unethical determinants such as greed, personal ego, corruption, lack of foresight, ignorance, oppression. Basically, Scheinfeld thinks that Gen Z seems to feel like things are not good, and they don't feel hopeful about the future. They feel like people have left things too late, and now it all falls to them, and they have no money and no power, and they have to fix everything because everyone else has dropped the ball. And so then Scheinfeld poses the question, is all of the young adult lit that's coming out that's so dystopic or post-apocalyptic, is it all an act of rebellion, an act of subversion? Is it an act of, protest? Is it trying in it and of itself to change things, to urge people to act? It's an open question. She doesn't answer it, but I'll let you think about it. So that is the end of your 2 lectures from our week before reading week, when we were asked to read the article by Shayna Sheinfeld about apocalypticism in pop culture, and also asked to think about modern, contemporary apocalypses. Particularly this week, we were thinking about literature and your novel, Good Omens. But we will look for the next coming weeks at other contemporary types of apocalyptic thinking, including environmental activism, which also uses a discourse about the end of the world and how to behave so that we are saved from the end of the world. So that's all for now. I'm sorry this was long, but it was actually 2 lectures rolled into one. See you soon.